All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us during the Lytham Partners Fall 2022 Investor Conference. My name is Robert Blum, Managing Partner of Lytham Partners. Up next here, we have a panel presentation, which we hope you'll find insightful, with executives from 3 different companies that are looking to advance innovations in rare diseases, or what are often designated by the FDA as orphan drugs. We have a diverse panel of participants that can hopefully each provide their own unique perspective on the topic. Before we sort of turn this over to the panel, I wanted to provide a little bit of background to help the conversation here. You know, over the decades, there's been tremendous scientific developments on many medical products and therapeutic advances for patients. But in the late 1970s, it was becoming clear that many citizens were being left out of many of these advances. One of the key reasons for this neglect was the small size of some of the patient populations. The relatively limited prevalence of particular disease acted as a barrier for commercial investment in the research and development required to show evidence of safety and efficacy of treatments. I think, as a FDA historian had noted, that ironically by the early 1980s, these quote unquote rare diseases had affected 20 to 25 million patients who together suffered from approximately 5,000 different rare diseases. In response, organizations were established in the Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA, which was called the Office of Orphan Product Development, to promote the development of products to treat these quote unquote orphan diseases. You know, later a coalition was formed in the early 1980s, which evolved into the National Organization for Rare Disorders, which helped to lead in the 1983 enactment of the Orphan Drug Act. That Orphan Drug Act provided financial incentives to attract the industry interest through a 7-year period of marketing exclusivity for a drug approved to treat an orphan disease, even if it were not under patent. Tax credits of up to 50% for research and development expenses, for instance. In addition, the FDA was authorized to designate drugs and biologics for orphan status, which is the first step to getting sort of orphan development incentives, provide grants for clinical testing of orphan products, and offer assistance in how to frame protocols for investigations. A subsequent amendment defined a rare disease as one affecting under 200,000 people, though a disease with more patients could qualify if a company could not recover sort of the cost of developing the drug there. You know, the 1983 Orphan Drug Act completely changed the face of therapeutics for rare disorders. By 1990, the FDA designated 370 products for orphan status, and of these, 49 were approved for orphan indications. By 2002, the number of orphan designations grew to almost 1,100 and approvals to 232, a number that provided treatment to an estimated 11 million patients. You know, much more work, of course, needs to be done, but sort of considering how many are still suffering from rare disorders. Before I turn it over to our panelists, as I was doing some research here, sort of some of additional stats that I thought were interesting. According to Evaluate Research, orphan drug sales growth continues at twice the rate of the broader pharma market. Over half of the FDA approvals in 2021 were for orphan drugs for the treatment of rare disease. And the report I mentioned just a moment ago states that by 2026, orphan drugs are projected to make up 20% of all prescription drugs and almost a third of the value of the total global drug pipeline. And also by 2026, it states there that the top 10 orphans will all be worth somewhere between $3 and $10 billion. So I hope that provides a little bit of background for those that may not be familiar, and hopefully frame this discussion a little bit further. One sort of housekeeping item, if you're not familiar, Lytham Partners is one of the country's leading investor relations firm with more than 2 decades of corporate access experience. We've built one of the industry's most diverse and effective platforms for connecting small cap companies with high quality and focused institutional investors, while sort of simultaneously creating a framework of best practices in all aspects of investor relations. So, my apologies for the long intro there, but I thought it would help to frame this discussion a little bit better. So, with all of that said, if everyone could maybe go around the room, introduce themselves, provide a little background on themselves and their company. And Jan, why don't we begin with you?
Okay, thank you, Robert. Again, my name is Jan Delvise. I'm the president and CEO of Acasti Pharma, and I've been with Acasti now for over 6 years. I started my career on the commercial side with Big Pharma and rose to the position of vice president of drug development and business unit head for Syntex and eventually Roche, and ran their pain and inflammation division. I actually led the team that developed and commercialized Toradol and several line extensions for naproxen, and then put together the deal that actually led to Aleve being commercialized OTC. I left Roche to become a serial entrepreneur, and I started 2 companies, built them to a point of sustainable revenue growth. They were subsequently acquired by bigger companies. And prior to joining Acasti, I also had the opportunity to lead turnarounds for a couple troubled companies. I found strategic buyers for both those, resulting in nice exits for both our investors and employees. And maybe just briefly about Acasti, we are a specialty pharma company with core capabilities in drug delivery and drug formulation. And we've developed a range of patented technologies that we've applied to currently marketed drugs that we believe can significantly improve the mode of administration, bioavailability, absorption, patient convenience, and very importantly, safety and efficacy. So we currently have 3 orphan drug candidates in the clinic, and I think I'll have the opportunity later to tell you more about those. And we have several other additional interesting pipeline assets at a preclinical stage.
Great, thank you, Jan. Josh, why don't you proceed?
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and great to be on the panel with you, Jan, and you, Lisa, and thanks for having us. I'm Josh Disbrow, co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Aytu BioPharma. My background is largely commercial and entrepreneurial ventures, having started, like Jan, in Big Pharma. I started off carrying the bag with what was then called Glaxo Wellcome and became GlaxoSmithKline. Rose through the ranks and got a taste of what it's like to work within a big company. But my identical twin brother and I, who was also a drug rep, we both got bitten by the startup bug in our 20s. So didn't spend a lot of time in Big Pharma. He went and ran marketing at a small cough, cold, allergy company in Spec Pharma. I went and ran marketing at a small cardiovascular diagnostics laboratory, and we never considered working for a big company again. He, at the ripe old age of 31, which I guess would have made me 31, founded a company called Orphan Pharmaceuticals out of his spare bedroom in Raleigh, our hometown. And we built it to revenues, got the first products onto the market. We focused in pediatrics, which I'll come back to. We've come full circle here at Aytu. Founded the company, started it with $500,000 in seed money, and grew it to an exit when we sold our family stake to KKR. They valued the company at over $1 billion, having generated over $250 million in annual revenues the year I left. We parlayed that success, and I moved my family out to beautiful Colorado, where I live to this day, and founded and came on as COO of a publicly traded biotech company, from which Aytu was spun in 2015. We did a dumb thing, which I've done a lot of in my career, which was we listed the company initially on the bulletin board, which was not a great decision, but we ultimately scrapped our way to the NASDAQ, listed on NASDAQ in 2017. And we built the company to about $100 million in revenue. When this broadcasts, we will have announced our fiscal 22 results for the year ending June 30th, where we'll post $27.4 million for that quarter and about $97 million in annualized revenue. And we've built the company largely with a focus on pediatrics, and we've just begun to build out a pediatric onset rare disease pipeline, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Our commercial infrastructure is about a 50-person sales force. We sell to pediatricians and ADHD specialists. About $50 million of our $100 million in revenue is 2 proprietary orally disintegrating tablet formulations of both an amphetamine and a methylphenidate. We have those products products in our product portfolio now by virtue of an acquisition that we made of Neos Therapeutics in March of last year. We also have a consumer division because in 2022, if you're going to access patients, you need to be as close to the consumer and as digitized as you can be. So we have a sales force, but we also have a full digital platform, and we sell a suite of about $35 million worth of consumer products. So we cover the waterfront with a very diverse base of 5 prescription products, a sales force that are selling those, and about 20 non-prescription products that we sell largely through online channels, inclusive of Amazon. And we made a bold decision last year following the Neos transaction to acquire a private company called Rumpus Therapeutics, and that serves as the basis for our first foray into pediatric rare disease and orphan drugs with what we call AR101, which is a repurposed small molecule from Lilly that we'll talk about. So a lot going on for a little company, but we're generating revenues. We're cash flowing on the RX side of the business, soon to cash flow on the consumer side of the business. Do burn some money on the pipeline, but just did a financing to enable us to get that started, and are looking forward to getting what we call the PREVENT trial in VEDS underway very soon. So long-winded way of saying glad to be here. Thanks for the time.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Lisa, why don't you wrap up there?
Thanks. Very, very impressive. I'm pleased to be on the panel with you. I'm very grateful to Lytham Partners for the investor relations platform that you have for small cap companies. My name is Lisa Conte. I'm the founder, president, and CEO of Jaguar Health, our wholly owned subsidiary, Napo Pharmaceuticals, and a company that we established last year in Europe, Napo Therapeutics. And what we do is all drug discovery from plants that are used traditionally in tropical areas. So we do focus on plant-based products, and primarily in the gastrointestinal area, where we do commercialize the first product that we took from a tree growing in the rainforest to a first-in-class anti-secretory agent called Mytesi, and it is approved for HIV-related diarrhea. And Jaguar is focused on the pipeline and the product opportunity of crofelemer. Because of the novel mechanism of action of normalizing gut function, it has about 8 different follow-on indications. The lead is in phase 3 clinical trials right now, a final phase 3 clinical trial for cancer therapy-related diarrhea. Then we realized some of the orphan rare disease opportunities in the GI area that we have with this molecule, crofelemer, specifically intestinal failure associated with short bowel syndrome, intestinal failure associated with the rare congenital diarrheal disorders in pediatrics, and even in cholera, an acute situation, obviously, where patients get dramatically dehydrated and lose electrolytes and are at risk of death in a very short period of time. To pursue that, we established Napo Therapeutics last year, as I mentioned, in Italy. And there's 3 main reasons why we set it up there. The first was because we were dealing with a molecule, not a product, because it's a different formulation, but a molecule that has already been through chronic safety testing. It's in a product, Mytesi, that is approved for chronic use. We knew we had a strong safety profile, and we wanted, and we obviously have a full supply chain in place, a GMP supply chain in place. So we wanted to have patients be very patient-focused, have access to this product as early as possible. So we were attracted to the early patient access program in Europe. Once we decided that that was where we wanted to do the initial clinical development for the orphan indications, we decided to put a team that had done that before that could have this as their primary and sole focus to expedite product development. So we established a management team in Napo Therapeutics. And then the last piece really has to do with the company identity. Jaguar is known as a plant-based GI company. We're not known as an orphan product company, and it'll take some time for that identity to get absorbed into the company picture.
Well, thank you all for being here and being part of the panel here. Jan, let's come back to you here. Acasti is pursuing, as you mentioned, 3 different orphan drug opportunities. I'll have you sort of expand on some of the specifics maybe in just a moment. But, in your opinion, what are some of the reasons you made the decision to build sort of this business model on the pursuit of these rare diseases? Maybe talk about some of the benefits as you see them.
Sure. Well, as you stated earlier, many of the patients with the 5,000 plus identified rare diseases remain significantly underserved. And, we believe this continues to be a big opportunity for the pharma industry, and especially for small and microcap companies like ours, and for several reasons, really. First, the development programs for these indications can be much smaller, typically requiring fewer patients, and therefore they're much less costly. They can take a lot less time. And in our case, because we are reformulating and repurposing marketed drugs, they also have the potential to lower the clinical and regulatory risk profile as well. So now we specifically chose to focus on reformulating, repurposing marketed drugs primarily in CNS. And this was based on what we believe are significant unmet patient needs, sizable market opportunities, as well as the previous experience and expertise of our team. And you touched on the size of the overall orphan market earlier, but I wanted to mention that orphan CNS drugs accounted for about $13 billion in sales last year alone. And the orphan CNS market is projected to grow to over $25 billion by 2026. So there's a lot of really interesting opportunity here. And furthermore, for us, we believe there's a lot of interest from big pharma in this space. They're really focused and committed to orphan drugs. And, I think this is going to continue to fuel M&A activity in this space in the future. So, for us, we saw it providing really nice partnering opportunities as well as potentially a future exit for investors.
Right. Josh, maybe building a little bit off Jan's answer there, you've recently initiated a phase 3 trial for the treatment of patients with VEDS. And again, we'll get into specifics maybe in just a moment there, but from a bigger picture perspective, what are some of the insights, some of the benefits that you see from a company perspective, obviously besides, being able to help these patients, about pursuing rare drug or rare disease opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And as you said, obviously the main one is the benefit to these patients that in the case of VEDS, which we'll describe a little bit later, is a catastrophic deadly disease for which there are no treatments anywhere on the planet. So obviously that's a huge benefit, but certainly the regulatory benefits are vast, particularly in the major markets in the U.S. As we all know, the United States affords you a handful of things, and depending on the various designations, obviously you get a lot of flexibility. So first and foremost, of course, you get market exclusivity by virtue of your orphan designation. That clearly in the U.S. allows for 7 years, in some cases 7 years plus of exclusivity. So irrespective of any composition of matter or method of use IP, which of course we have wrapped around our suite, you get the market exclusivity. So you obviously get the same types of benefits in places like Europe. You get 10 years in Europe, you get 10 plus years in Japan, 6 plus years in Korea, depending on various circumstances. And these are markets that still do command price. And while they don't have pricing levels to the degree that you see here in the United States, it's significantly higher price points than you would see for particularly small molecules, of which this is one. And also, as the other two panelists would attest, you get a much higher level of engagement with the agencies, whether that's the EMA or the FDA or anywhere around the world. You get a high level of engagement, you get a much higher frequency of interaction. There tends to be some flexibility, and the negotiations are less hard and fast. There tends to be openness to various permutations of the endpoints, and obviously they want to encourage you to be as efficient as you can. And then if you get a designation such as we've received fast track designation, that allows for sort of an even higher level of more frequent and faster communication throughout the process. And again, particularly with orphan drugs. So it's a combination of, you get the market exclusivity, there's an ability to get pricing, and then you've got a great deal of flexibility and sort of just ability in general to really partner with the agency. And, as an example, this is a molecule that's been studied largely in adults, and it was never approved. So it's not a repurposed commercialized product, but it was a small molecule that Eli Lilly developed and later shelved. It was studied almost exclusively in adults, but the agency didn't want kids to have to wait because, as I'll describe later, this is a pediatric and adolescent onset disease, VEDS that is. And so they're allowing for an interim analysis following which we can sprinkle in a healthy number of adolescent patients. We won't have enough patients in there to generate a p-value that generates efficacy data, but we'll have it in the label. And that was their suggestion. They said, we don't want to have these patients wait and wait for approval or wait for an open label extension, for example. And so that's just one example of the benefits you get from a regulatory perspective with an orphan drug.
Great. And Lisa, maybe you can weigh in here a bit, as you sort of mentioned, the core mission of Napo Therapeutics, the company that Jaguar founded in Italy last year, and for which Jaguar is a majority shareholder, is to provide access to your crofelemer drug product in Europe to address these sort of significant rare and orphan disease indications. I think the two initial targets of short bowel syndrome and congenital diarrheal disorders rather with intestinal failure. Big picture again, why was the decision made to create this sort of European entity to specifically focus on these rare orphan disease indications? And how does sort of orphan drug development strategically fit within Jaguar's mission there?
So let me take the last question first. Orphan drug development, for all the reasons that you heard from the panelists, is becoming a core focus of Jaguar Health. We do have our Mytesi franchise, which is commercialized and in a late-stage clinical trial, but these rare disease indications for the molecule crofelemer are very important and quite relevant for a business strategy for a emerging small cap company. So that's why we put our focus there. Again, we've established it initially in Europe because I mentioned the early patient access program, because we have this molecule that is already in another form commercialized, and we have such confidence about the safety and the mechanism of action. So this is our theory. We feel that the early patient access program, which is meaningful revenue generation, when a product has demonstrated proof of concept in a published format and has orphan drug designation through the EMA. So we have orphan drug designation for short bowel syndrome. We have it on file for congenital diarrheal disease. We've already started the support for an investigator-initiated proof of concept study in Abu Dhabi and in the Mideast, of course, because of cultural practices. Congenital diseases often have a greater prevalence. And it's a researcher, a key opinion leader that we've worked with for many years, and we've targeted publication in December of this year. So back to why the EMA. Our theory is that because you have single-payer healthcare systems and these patients with these chronic diseases and high levels of mortality and morbidity are so expensive to take care of, there is a financial incentive, we feel, from these healthcare organizations and these government programs to get promising products to patients as early as possible. And the collateral benefit of that, of course, is the patient focus and the opportunity to provide some treatment to patients that have no other alternative and are living with such heavy burdens, both in the quality of life, the health burden, the comfort of the patient. So we are pursuing that. All the data, of course, that is generated is available to Jaguar because this is a company that was established under license to Jaguar. And we will, as rapidly as possible, move to bring these products to the United States and the rest of the world as well. We have noted that the ALS community, which is not a patient community that we focus on, has worked with Congress to have something similar to the early access patient program that you have in the EMA. And maybe that will be something that will become broader based on these really important patient groups that have developed in the United States and around the world.
Jan, thinking about some of maybe the financial incentives, I mentioned at the onset there, some of the incentives that the FDA has looked to put in place. Talk about what you've seen out there as it relates specifically to Acasti.
Well, I think, both you and Josh and Lisa have touched on this. I mentioned earlier that a major incentive for smaller companies like Acasti is the lower cost, faster, potentially less risky development programs required to get these orphan drugs approved. I think Josh mentioned the orphan drug designation gives you market exclusivity above and beyond patents, that you might have. And then I think you mentioned earlier the tax credits, up to 50% of the costs, expenses incurred in clinical research in the United States can be, used as tax credits once you get approval. I don't think we mentioned the fact that the FDA will actually waive the PDUFA fees, once you do get approval. So this has a value of, could be $1 million to $2 million. Josh mentioned, we found too that the FDA has been incredibly generous in terms of giving us their time and attention. We have 2 programs in particular where, they have given us just excellent guidance on, the clinical design, statistical assessment, and they're also have been very good about giving us guidance on how we can get fast track designation for, NDA, rapid NDA review. I don't think we touched on market pricing and reimbursement. I think maybe this is something you're going to dig into more in the future, but, orphan drugs do command premium pricing relative to non-orphans, and reimbursement is much less of an issue than it is obviously for drugs for chronic diseases, with large markets. I guess I would also mention, and 2 of our 3 candidates in the pipeline really meet this criteria where we can commercialize these drugs ourselves because the population is so small and the market is so targeted. In the case of our GTX-104, which is a IV infusion of nimodipine for subarachnoid hemorrhage, we're targeting the top, roughly 400 stroke centers in the United States. This is a market we can reach ourselves. So really for, a minimum, marketing, selling, investment, you can really build some very nice markets if you're a small company. So
no, that's a really good point, and I do want to touch on reimbursement here in just a moment. Josh, you touched on this, and I don't know if there's anything maybe to expand upon here, but when you look around the world, besides the U.S., we talked about Europe, Korea, a few of the other areas, maybe some of the incentives that are in place there, is the landscape similar to the U.S., or, what sort of and again, a significant portion of the bed's population actually resides outside the U.S. So what are some of the incentives that might be out there around the world?
Yeah, similar types of incentives. And as I touched on earlier, actually longer durations of market exclusivity in the EU and in Japan. Both of those markets are 10 years, and in some cases, there's the ability to get some extension. And if you've got pediatric indications, there's sort of additional allowances. As I mentioned, South Korea, 6 years as well. And other markets are sort of evaluating, while places like Canada they don't specifically have a market exclusivity. They're weighing sort of those options, and so there's an opportunity certainly from that perspective. And again, incentives with whether it's specific things around various tax structures. Of course, Lisa's spoken in depth about the early access programs throughout Europe, and there's places like France that have a specific program. They all have sort of their unique twist, but the EU is actually very favorable for many reasons. Again, you can be commercializing prior to a formal approval, assuming you've got proof of concept. That's something, as Lisa alluded to, we would love to get here in the United States. There's, for the first time, some whispers in and around ALS. So in many ways, Europe is actually more favorable in terms of an opportunity to generate some revenue. It's no secret that small companies, we need access to non-dilutive sources of capital, obviously generating revenue prior to an approval, even if it's at a lower rate and at a lower rate, and even through some kind of a rebate scheme, as is the case with some of these EAP schemes. That's revenue you couldn't otherwise generate until you have a full approval. And of course, that may have to follow years of an open label extension in some cases. And in the case of beds, it's a relatively long study, which I'll describe here shortly. The ability to jump ahead potentially 2, 3, 4, 5 years in some cases is a dramatic and a significantly positive benefit. So, and of course, again, as Jan has mentioned, pricing's significantly higher, multiples higher than it would be in categories like allergy, asthma, immunology, anything, frankly, other than a rare disease. Payers have really had their way, particularly in the United States, in depressing net net selling prices for small molecules and that are, or even in some cases, large molecules. If they address a market with any competition at all, they can essentially wipe you off the face of the earth from a payment perspective. So they don't have nearly the leverage they do. And in Europe, because of the single payer systems, they recognize that as well, and they put a real value on it. So a lot of benefits. And the U.S. is really for the first time, at least in my career, it's not 50, 60, 70% of a drug's potential in some cases. It may be less than 50 or even less than that in terms of as a percentage of its total revenue potential, depending on the demographics and so forth. So a lot of opportunity globally.
Well, let's expand upon that, Lisa. We're sort of talking about the reimbursement levels here. Maybe talk about some of the differences that you're seeing from the orphan drugs versus the non-orphan designated drugs, specifically in Europe as well, where you're operating.
Yeah, appreciate that. And, obviously, yes, for these very, very small markets, there's premium pricing. But let's talk about why there's premium pricing. It's not just because of the exclusivity and the lack of competition, because these patients, again, with the high mortality and high morbidity, typically are very expensive to take care of. And so there is value for the it's not just premium pricing because you can get premium pricing, it's because of the value that you're bringing to the health of the patient. So, for example, with intestinal failure, what does intestinal failure mean? The patient is on parenteral nutrition, which is catastrophic for their life. Often 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, often at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year without complications. And who doesn't have complications when they're hooked up to tubes to get their nutrients of life 7 days a week? So that's a very important factor, in addition to the exclusivity, in addition to the lower cost of development, in addition to having the incentives to develop these products, why they typically are higher reimbursed. And that's, of course, why we're pursuing this in Europe, as we said, to first and foremost focus on the patients, get hopefully a safe and effective molecule to them, get the company in a position where it can get reimbursement for providing these products with early access, and then have the time to go through the full development program and ultimately bring these products around the globe.
Great. Well, I've appreciated all of your sort of insights on sort of the macro picture here. Let's dive a little bit more into company specifics now. Jan, let's start with you. Maybe help educate the audience on the various rare disease programs that you're pursuing.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 drugs in the clinic right now. Our most advanced program is GTX-104. This is, as I mentioned, it's an IV infusion, continuous infusion of nimodipine, and it's the indication is for subarachnoid hemorrhage, and this is bleeding on the brain that's caused by a ruptured aneurysm. This is a very life-threatening condition. These patients typically 10 to 15% die before they get to the hospital. They're typically rushed in for immediate surgery to repair the aneurysm. And then they're put on nimodipine during their hospital stay. These folks are typically in the intensive care unit for 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes even longer. And during that entire period, the physician wants them on nimodipine to help maintain a lower blood pressure to allow more oxygenated blood to get into the damaged area of the brain. And nimodipine has been shown to improve neurological outcomes in these patients. So we're replacing, or we hope to replace, a current oral form of the drug that's on the market. We think the IV is going to provide more consistent blood levels, which should translate into better control of blood pressure. It's really critical that the blood pressure be carefully maintained in these patients. And we think it could lead to maybe shorter length of stay, better outcomes. Again, this is a situation that affects roughly 50,000 people in the United States each year. It is a very costly condition to treat. It can cost, upwards of $250,000 a year or for that time in the hospital to treat these patients. And then our second drug is a pediatric drug. It's what we've done is reformulated betamethasone, which is a glucocorticosteroid. It's been around forever, used in many indications, but we're reformulating it and repurposing it for ataxia telangiectasia. This is a very sad neurodegenerative genetic disorder. It affects kids very young, typically, if they're diagnosed between the ages of 1 and 3. They have severe coordination, neurological impact. It also significantly infects their immune system. So these kids are subject to infection. Sadly, also cancers, blood cancers, brain cancer. They don't typically live beyond their mid-20s or so. And there's currently no treatment for them today. They'll get physical therapy, speech therapy to treat the symptoms, but there really is no drug therapy. And so we would be the first drug to be approved for this indication. And it's really interesting how this came about. These patients were put on betamethasone or dexamethasone, other corticosteroids, to treat their cancers, and physicians actually saw a significant improvement in their ataxia symptoms. So we've reformulated betamethasone, which is only available in the United States as an injectable. We've reformulated it into a very convenient, easy to use oral mucosal spray that rapidly absorbs through the tongue and oral mucosa. So we're delivering actually 1/70th the dose of betamethasone, and we think this will lower, side effects and make it more amenable to be used chronically. And by the way, I should mention, I think I said earlier, 104 is about to enter phase 3. We're just finishing up a bridging study for GTX 102. And we would expect to move into phase 3 next year with that program. And then finally, to wrap up, GTX 101 is being targeted for post-herpetic neuralgia, which is a very severe nerve pain that tends to follow a shingles infection after the shingles blisters heal. The virus settles into the nerve fibers and is exceedingly painful. These patients typically are put on oral gabapentin because it's cheap, but it doesn't work. So they typically reflex to a lidocaine patch, which is more expensive. The patch has problems in that, it takes 2 weeks to actually work, and it can only be worn for 12 hours. So it's 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And so there's a lot of breakthrough pain. Many of these patients end up on opioids, which we know has huge abuse potential. So what we've done is taken this analgesic bupivacaine, which is very commonly used in dental surgeries. It has a very fast onset of action, but a very nice PK profile in that you see this nice sustained pain relief over, a good 12 to 24 hour period. So we've reformulated it into a topical spray. So very convenient to spray on wherever you have pain. And it rapidly absorbs into the skin. Within 10 minutes, you could go swimming, take a shower. But we are seeing very rapid, reaction, pain relief, and looks like it can be once a day dosing, which would give 24/7 pain coverage, which is great. So we're very excited about this program. It's a little earlier. We're finishing up a phase 1 study now and expect to move into phase 2 next year.
Great. Thank you for that, Jan.
Sure.
Josh, let's turn over to you. Maybe do the same. Talk a little bit about VEDS for those that aren't familiar with the disease and how you're looking at bringing relief to this patient population here.
Yeah, VEDS is a catastrophic inherited disease. VEDS stands for vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it is the most severe subtype of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a group of connective tissue disorders. This VEDS is, as I said, it's the vascular subtype, and it affects the vasculature and really every sort of hollow organ and throughout the arterial tree, such that these patients, by virtue of a mutation and an aberrant cell signal, they die of catastrophic arterial ruptures, aneurysms, and they end up bleeding out and dying. And this often happens spontaneously. And when you're handed a VEDS diagnosis, unfortunately, you're handed a death sentence. This is a dramatically life-shortening disease. such that on average, patients die by their 51st birthday. Patients typically are diagnosed in early adolescence. They may be diagnosed much earlier in the event that they have a parent that has been diagnosed. And some of these are spontaneous developments, but it is an autosomal dominant disease such that if a parent has it, it's a 50-50 chance that a child will have it. And so, for example, in the case of many anecdotes that I've become aware of in the last 2 years since we acquired this asset, the dad gets diagnosed and either died or just had a catastrophic event and ended up in the emergency room. They then test the progeny and realize that 2 of the 3 sons in the case of this one family have it. And here you have the mom who realizes she's going to lose her husband and may unfortunately bury 2 of her 3 sons as well. It's despite the fact that it's dominant, it's still relatively rare. It affects about 1 in 50,000 patients. And again, it affects all the vasculature such that you could have a spleen bleed out and die. Many women of childbearing age, of gestational age, they may actually die in the delivery room because there's a hormonal element to this. And the bottom line is there's no treatment anywhere on the planet. It has heretofore been thought that these patients, they have a deficient gene. They have a mutation of the COL3A1 gene, which is the gene that's chiefly responsible for encoding type 3 collagen, which serves as the building blocks for the human vasculature, any mammalian vasculature for that matter. And what you see is these patients have relatively brittle vasculature such that they don't even need an insult, they can just die. That was what was heretofore believed was the cause of the disease. It's this brittle vasculature that just essentially breaks, they get a tear, and they bleed out and die. Well, fast forward, and the research is now robust. A researcher, geneticist, and physician by the name of Dr. Harry Hal Dietz at Johns Hopkins University. He's got a dual appointment at Howard Hughes. He's dedicated his life to investigating connective tissue disorders, and he will tell you anytime you speak to him, his by far least favorite disease is VEDS, because it's the one that is most deadly and for which there are really no treatments therapeutically, medically, surgically, or otherwise. That these patients are just told to be watchful waiters, which we all know is essentially tantamount to doing nothing. And he spent his life researching these disorders, and he developed an animal model whereby he knocked in this COL3A1 mutation into a mouse. And it perfectly recapitulated the human condition such that these animals would die almost immediately and very, very quickly after birth. They would die of these identical arterial aortic ruptures, and they would manifest in the exact same way as it manifests in the human conditions. So dramatically shorten these already short mouse lives even shorter. And he thought he was onto something. But what he realized is there was a particular type of mouse that if you just knocked in the mutation, they would still go on and they would live normal lives. And what he realized was it was a separate sort of insult that was happening, and that these animals had upregulation of a particular kinase, protein kinase C specifically, and that these animals would die much more quickly, and again in the same way, and then manifest the events in the same way that the human condition was. So he thought nature may have found a way to at least help us identify if we could squelch that signal and calm down that aberrant cell signal and downregulate that protein kinase C, you could potentially address this disease. And so he introduced a protein kinase C beta isoform that Eli Lilly had developed called enzostorin. And what do you know? He was able to reduce the rates of those catastrophic arterial events by upwards of 90%, 60 to 90% reduction in this animal model. And so they celebrated. It was published in JCI, and they were awarded a slew of patents, 4, in fact, the 4th of which we just swept into our license. And Rumpus Therapeutics, a company we acquired about 18 months ago, acquired the worldwide rights to that IP suite and went to the company that had bought the molecule out of Lilly and said, can we license your molecule? We coupled that with the intellectual property from Johns Hopkins and said, we have a method of use patent and an established molecule that Lilly never got approved because it fails in phase 3. They studied it for glioblastoma and DLBCL, and unfortunately did not show durability of remission. So they shelved it at phase 3 after having studied over 5,000 patients across 50 clinical studies, 10 pharmacokinetic studies, established dose optimization, safety, target saturation, and the whole 9 yards, CMC, and the list goes on. And we took the preclinical data and coupled that with some ex vivo data that shows that patients that die of these aortic ruptures, if you look at the protein kinase C levels in the exact locus of those tears and aneurysms, it is off the charts. off the charts. And so the FDA actually allowed it to say, go ahead and do a proof of concept study, but guess what? That's your registrational study because it's a rare disease. And so while there's no proof of concept data in the humans, we get to generate that. And if it shows efficacy and it shows reduction of events in any meaningful way, it's likely approvable. And so we're now set, and some people think we're crazy. It's okay. It's not the first time an entrepreneur has been called crazy. It's a risk worth taking because there's plausible clinical benefit. There's safety. We know the dose, the exact same dose that Eli Lilly uses fully saturates the target. And so we know we can get to a level that we turn off the signal in equal molar doses. When you turn that signal off in the mice, as I said, you get 60 to 90% reduction in events. It's quite miraculous. And patients quite literally are dying by the day. You can imagine in the context of an AdCom, if it came to that, it's going to be a raucous room because even if you show 15 or 20% reduction in events, as the parent of someone who has VEDS, you can imagine that mom or dad in that room saying, why would we not approve a safe molecule that's demonstrated some clinical benefit, even if it's not 60 to 90%, which was seen in the animal studies. And we know animal studies don't always translate, but when you are able to perfectly recapitulate the condition and you're able to in an equal molar amount, turn off the signal that seems to be the causal agent with this aberrant cell signal, this upregulation, you may be onto something. We've got a highly engaged VEDS community. Despite the rare nature of this disease, it's deadly. And so similar to ALS, it is a very, very active community all over the world. And as you can imagine, we've engaged with all the major players. And these patients, of course, cluster at the major treatment centers. It's the who's who of the tertiary care centers. It's the Mayos, it's the Mount Sinai's, it's the Stanfords, it's the Imperial College in London, and the list goes on. And as it so happens, the chair of our SAB is Dr. Hal Dietz, and we have the world's leading VEDS experts surrounding us at the table, helping us think through the protocol. And the FDA gave us a safe to proceed. The EMA gave us study may proceed as well. So we're ready to start dosing patients in the next, we hope, 3 to 4 months once we get our clinical study supply up. And obviously, the capital markets have not been favorable to small companies. I think both of my colleagues can agree with that. We need to raise a little bit more capital, but assuming we can get enough raised to start the study, our attitude is these patients can't wait, so we'll start the study. It's going to take some time to enroll it. If it reads out positively, it's a game changer. And of course, this is a huge economic opportunity for the company as well. When you think about an unmet need, the only treatment in town, anywhere on the planet for that matter, IP filed all over the world, and a patient community that's thirsting for this. So while it's not 3 assets like Jan has, it's 1, and we think it's a really exciting asset, and it's ready to go into phase 3 right now.
Fantastic. Josh, thank you so much. Lisa, let's sort of wrap up here with Jaguar. Add to the focus of crofelemer in patients with sort of short bowel syndrome, with intestinal failure, congenital diarrheal disorders, sort of expand and provide some additional background there for us.
Sure, yeah. And so what we have is one molecule with multiple different clinical opportunities. So the situation with short bowel syndrome patients, all of us who are normal have a gut that's about 25 feet. Short bowel is 5 feet or less. It can be as short as 30 centimeters. So it's a very heterogeneous population. A patient could be in that situation because it could be congenital. It could be due to an accident. It could be surgery from cancer or some sort of inflammation, IBD, Crohn's disease. In any event, these patients end up with intestinal failure, meaning, as I mentioned earlier, they have to go on parenteral nutrition because they don't have enough real estate. There's not enough length in the gut for them to absorb the nutrients of life: proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, minerals. There's huge complications associated with parenteral nutrition. There's just, we can't reproduce what happens naturally. And so these patients do end up with lots of complications. They end up in the hospital, and they end up with shortened lives and a great deal of morbidity as well, and a great deal of expense. The approach to date has been the standard of care is parenteral nutrition, but about a little less than 10% of the patients will also get some short-term treatment with something called GLP-2 analogs. And the goal there is it's essentially a growth hormone, is to maybe grow the gut a little bit so that parenteral nutrition can be reduced by maybe 15 to 20%. There's a fair amount of toxicity associated with this mechanism of action. There's cardiovascular toxicity, endocrinology toxicity. The patients can't stay on it chronically. They can't go on it until after surgery. For example, there has been complete adaptation over a year to that particular surgery. So what we're looking to do with crofelemer, which is an anti-secretory agent, which normalizes gut function, is to decrease the level of secretion into the gut to get to the same goal, to reduce parenteral nutrition by 15 to 20%, and also to do what crofelemer does to, obviously these patients, it's like a sieve, whatever goes in comes right out. So to bring about stool formation, reduce the diarrhea impact, and also do a measure on quality of life, which has not been done with the GLP-2 analog mechanism of action, and therefore inhibits reimbursement in many different European countries. So the proof of concept investigator-initiated program has started. That's going to include both short bowel syndrome patients and congenital diarrheal disease patients. These are patients who have the full length of their gut, but they also have intestinal failure. Essentially, the channels that control the secretion and absorption in the gut are just wide open all the time due to congenital disorder. And it's like having cholera every single day of your life. So that's going on right now. Well, we've had the same experience that the other two panelists have talked about with the EMA, really good advice and access on developing the clinical program. So the program for full approval will start in the EMA or in Europe in the first half of next year. And that's sort of an independent pathway to this proof of concept leading to the early patient access and getting some relief to these patients as quickly as possible. And then because Jaguar right now is focused on its Mytesi, the anti-secretory approach for AIDS, it's approved for AIDS-related diarrhea. It's in the final phase 3 for cancer therapy-related diarrhea. When that completes next year, we expect to complete enrollment in the first half of 2023, hopefully read it out and have the expanded label for Mytesi, we'll then be able to embrace data that is being generated through Napo Therapeutics in Europe and work towards approval for these rare diseases in the United States as well.
Well, look, I think we went well over the time I originally was expecting, but I think this has been fascinating. I think from a human element, I can't imagine that there's anyone that isn't rooting for all of you to sort of advance the drugs and the solutions that you're trying to bring to these patients. You know, I'm appreciative of you sort of being on the panel and providing some insight to the audience here. You know, certainly greatly appreciated. I guess I'll maybe mention this. You know, if anyone within the audience would like to get in touch with Jan or Josh or Lisa here, send me an email, Blum, BLUM, at lythampartners.com, or I'm sure you can reach out to each of the panelists here respectively as well, and sort of expand upon, you know, this conversation in more detail. So again, to all of you, thank you so much for being a part of this. Greatly appreciate it. We hope you all enjoy the conference here, and look forward to speaking again shortly.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Really appreciate it. Nice meeting you both.
Nice meeting you. Thanks for having us. Thanks, Robert.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.